Hello and welcome to my channel. In this tutorial in Vue.js, we will be creating a set of editor components. So let's get started. As usual, we are starting with a minimal Vue.js application in a single HTML file being served on port 8080 by the live server npm package. If you want to see how to use it, please take a look at my previous video about creating an application layout component with Vue.js. You will find a link to that episode in the description. First, let's make the message a little bigger by using the h1 tag. Then we'll create a very simple input with label that will modify the message. As you can see, the header is now editable. Let's move the editor into a separate component called input with label. We will start by defining the template, which will be pretty much identical to the one we used in our application template with one small difference. We will make the label changeable by introducing a label prop. To make our input field fully configurable, we'll use the vbind directive without any particular property. This will allow us to pass all the things that we want down into the input field without having to manually specify them in the props section. In fact, the declared label prop will not be part of the $attrs object, and therefore we can use it freely in other parts of the template. Just like with the attributes, we can use the von directive with the $listeners field to bind all the event handlers passed on from the users of this component. Now let's define the component so that Vue knows what we mean by the name input with label. As mentioned before, we need to define the label prop so that it won't be passed directly to the input. And it seems the component is rendering just fine, so let's remove the original input field, leaving just the new component. Please take a note that when we try to use the new input with label, it does not respond to the input event as we would expect. We can fix that by modifying the $listeners field with a computed property. This is a common practice in editor components to get the right events propagate properly. In our case, we will create a new object with all the fields from the original $listeners, and we will modify the input event to emit value from the inner input field. As a last step, we need to use the new computed property instead of the $listener field. That's how you wrap an editor component to enhance its functionality. Let's create another component called message editor. It will be different than the input with label in such way that we will be able to control when the value is emitted back to the parent by pressing a button. Please note, in this case we are using an intermediate value so that we can still use the vmodel on the internal input. Let's define the component for Vue so that it knows what we mean by message editor. Similarly to the previous component, we need to define the label as a separate field. However, this time we will also define the value prop so that it won't be passed on to the input when binding all attrs. We do that because we are binding the internal value instead. Obviously, we need to define the internal value as a data element for our component. Let's initialize it to the value that we have received from the parent. The last step is to define the listeners. It will look very similar to the previous example, only this time we just cancel the original event as we are emitting it manually by pressing the save button. And it works. But there is one small problem. When we modify the message outside of our message editor component, it doesn't know about it and still has the original value stored in internal value. The fix for it is pretty simple. We need to introduce a watcher that will trigger whenever the value prop is changed and update the internal value field with the new value. To sum it up, the editor component that works with vmodel directive is a component that takes a value prop and emits an input event whenever the value is updated. Such component can either be a live editor when the changes are immediately populated upwards, or can cache the edited value. That way, the component can decide to cancel the edit or propagate the change depending on the user interaction. Now that we have both components ready, let's see some vbind and von directives at work here. We will use the focus event to show when a particular component has been focused. While we're at it, we'll pass on the name property so that we can later on use it in the event handler to display which component has been actually focused. To summarize, use the vbind directive with the attrs field to bind all the fields that you are not manually specifying in the props section. Use the von directive to bind all event handlers passed on from the parent. To modify the list of listeners, create a listeners computed property, use the $listeners field provided by Vue, and overwrite whatever needs to be overridden in order for your component to work properly. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you found it interesting, give it a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe to not miss any new tutorials and click that bell button to get notified when new content is available. Till next time, bye bye!